This is James Mohler. I am the chair of the NCCN Prostate Cancer Panel for the past 15 years, which is probably why I was asked to speak to IPCU January 30th anniversary meeting on how one should respond to treating a patient who's denied coverage based on not conforming to the NCCN guidelines. I have no disclosures. I thought it appropriate that we begin with an examination of the guideline process so we know exactly what we're deviating from in the first place. The National Comprehensive Cancer Network is composed of a subset of the NCI-designated comprehensive cancer centers that pretty much cover the United States. This alliance of leading cancer centers is devoted to improving the quality, effectiveness, efficiency, and accessibility of cancer care to improve the lives of cancer patients. We seek to help elevate the level of cancer care not only nationally but globally. In order to do this, the NCCN puts out more than 73 guidelines, actually the 74th was approved last week, that feature algorithms that cover almost all the cancers in the United States. The process is iterative in that it responds to any new FDA ruling or newly published clinical trial, such that the guidelines are updated at least annually and often many times each year. For instance, the prostate cancer guideline this year is in its 4th version, and the 2020 guideline should be released any time now. The guideline process is designed to minimize bias. So each member institution contributes a panel member. The membership is selected so that it's multidisciplinary, geographically diverse, and has a variety of specialties and philosophical views represented. In addition, we have advocates, and our prostate panel has 2 who really contribute in a meaningful way. Each guideline is reviewed institutionally, and then that input is brought to the committee by the panel member. We also accept submissions, pay attention to international conferences, and have international guideline committees in many regions of the world that provide external review and input. We formally declare potential conflicts, and anyone with a conflict in a particular aspect of any guideline is recused from the process. There's a firewall between the guideline process and the rest of NCCN so that there is absolutely no industry input into the guidelines other than the formal submissions that they can make at any time. The panel members have very rigorously adhered to financial thresholds for outside activity, which does not include clinical trial support. The panel chairs and vice chairs have a little more stringent rules in that they cannot participate in any non-scientific activities involving industry or any other aspect of the healthcare process. So we accept submissions from industry, advocacy, and clinicians at any time through our website. And all of these are reviewed in a highly transparent fashion. The NCCN provides a drugs and biologics compendium that is very important because it is the authoritative reference for coverage decisions made by public and private payers, which most importantly includes CMS. Therefore, every word in the NCCN guideline is scrutinized by many entities, not just big pharma or industry. We are so iterative that changes to the NCCN guidelines because of a practice-changing study, typically a phase 3 clinical trial, often occurs before an FDA change is made to a label. There are many other compendiums that all list the FDA-approved uses, and appropriate uses beyond the FDA-approved label of biomarkers, imaging tests, radiation therapy, and we're just now beginning to develop a surgery compendium. Many of our NCCN centers and many other centers around the world use our chemotherapy order templates. In order to extend the guidelines to patients, there are 39 patient-friendly guidelines that are available from Amazon for $9. The prostate cancer guideline is especially well used and was most recently updated 1 year ago. So now that we understand the guideline process, how do we handle guideline recommendations and exactly what are they and their limitations? So we are very particular about indicating the level of evidence and the consensus of the panel that results in the specific recommendations made. Category 1 has high-level evidence for which there is uniform consensus. Category 2A, which is most of the guideline, particularly the prostate guideline, is based on lower-level evidence, but there is uniform consensus that the recommendation is appropriate. Category 2B is lower-level evidence, but the consensus that intervention is appropriate. We very rarely have a Category 3 recommendation in the guideline, which really means that a majority of the panel has great concerns, but that we felt that it was appropriate to include this possibility as one of the recommendations. Most importantly, almost all recommendations are Category 2A, unless indicated otherwise. And the most common other category to be used would be Category 1, where there's very high-level evidence. So we use the categories of preference to then rank within the categories how convinced the panel is that a recommendation should be preferred, just considered, or useful only under certain circumstances. This is somewhat confusing, so an NCCN patented methodology to address the different levels of evidence and confidence in the panel in the use of that evidence is the evidence block. This consists of 5 different ratings on a scale of 5 most favorable to 1 least favorable. And please note that affordability is the last column in the evidence block. Most decisions are based on efficacy, safety, quality and quantity of evidence, and consistency of the evidence. Only when all these matters are considered equal should affordability be considered. Now, what's the evidence that the NCCN guidelines are useful? The number of downloads is exploding. Over the last 10 years, the downloads have increased 5-fold. They have pretty much become the United States standard, as it is evidenced from their use by more than twice as many oncologists as any other guideline. The use of the prostate cancer guideline is second only to the breast guideline and probably stems from all the controversy about prostate cancer treatment, as well as the frequency of diagnosis of prostate cancer. There's a 43% increase just from 2017 to 2018 in guideline usage. So now we understand the guideline process and how the NCCN committee views the recommendations should be utilized. So what do we do with the coverage denial? Well, first let's look at how often that happens, because I believe it probably happens relatively infrequently, although there's very little data on this subject. The UNC group led by Ron Chen published a very interesting study using the SEER Medicare database about guideline concordance in patients with newly diagnosed prostate cancer. It's very reassuring that concordance was around 80 to 90% for patients with low or intermediate risk disease. Concordance fell a little bit when patients had more advanced disease or when they were quite elderly. The conclusion of the investigators was that the treatment of elderly but healthy patients with high-risk prostate cancer, the most aggressive form of this disease, probably was not as aggressive as it should have been. My group looked at the receipt of NCCN guideline concordant prostate cancer care among African and Caucasian Americans in North Carolina. The hypothesis was that Caucasian Americans would more frequently receive guideline concordant care. Unfortunately, this was disproven. We were very happy that 84% of men received guideline concordant care within 1 year of their diagnosis, and race did not impact the chance of receiving guideline concordant care at all. So NCCN guideline concordance has been examined in many other cancer types than prostate. Bob Carlson, the CEO of the NCCN, indicated that he'd never seen a study where outcomes were lower or costs were higher. Most but not all of the studies have used the NCCN guidelines. In other words, compliance with guidelines is probably a good thing, and the insurers should favor guideline compliance. So NCCN supports automatic authorization for guideline compliant care, but recognizes that this will apply to only about 80% of all appropriate care. Therefore, pre-authorization will be necessary for about 20% of cancer patients in general. Perhaps, as I indicated earlier, with the experience in the Medicare population, and specifically in North Carolina, that guideline compliant care in prostate cancer probably occurs more frequently than this. There are numerous studies that have been published on the advantage of guideline-derived care. For the obsessive-compulsive of you, here are a list of a variety of studies using the NCCN and other guidelines that demonstrate some improvement in outcome based on the use of guideline-appropriate care. In the last 2 years, there have been several studies published specifically on NCCN guideline-driven care, all of which show an improvement in outcome, including the one by Prezer et al. In prostate cancer. So guideline concordant care is common, but how frequent are insurance denials? This information is kept very closely, I think, by the insurers. And we have, as far as I know, only a single report on this subject. So Dr. Newcomer made available this article from a team of researchers, including Dr. Carlson. It was published 2.5 years ago. It looked at a 1-year pilot in Florida of a commercial health plan of 4,272 cases and compared the prior year to regional and national controls when they put in place an effort to enhance guideline compliance. Denials decreased from 4 to 1% with the use of this computer-based decision support tool driven by the NCCN guidelines. More importantly, there was a chemotherapy cost savings in Florida. Cost decreased by 9%, while at the same time they increased 10 and 11% regionally and nationally. What's reassuring is that guideline compliance might reduce denials and costs, but that the overall rate of denials is probably only as much as 4% nationally. So now we understand the guideline process, the guideline recommendations and how they should be interpreted, the frequency of occurrence of non-guideline compliant care, and can guess at the frequency of denials. So how does one approach a coverage denial? So the most important point to convey to the insurers is that guidelines are guidelines. They're not rules. In general, guideline concordance should be about 80%, and perhaps it's a little higher in prostate cancer. Dr. Carlson frequently indicates that concordance 100% of the time is probably suboptimal medicine. Not all patients can be placed in a perfect position on any guideline, no matter how complete and sophisticated the guideline is. On the other hand, concordance 20% of the time is certainly bad medicine. Concordance should be higher when there's high level of evidence. In other words, a Category 1 versus a Category 2A recommendation, which most of the guidelines are. And it should clearly be lower whenever the level of the evidence or the amount of consensus results in a Category 2B or the very rare Category 3 recommendation. So prostate cancer guidelines often depend on consensus because of the lack of high-level evidence. So you need to point out to the insurer who's denying your treatment that almost everything in prostate cancer is controversial. One should also remember that guideline panels have the option of ignoring any clinical situation that happens infrequently, and we use less than 5% as a standard for that, although I think our guidelines do cover far more than 95% of prostate cancer patients. Almost all insurance companies ultimately approve off-guideline therapy, particularly if that treatment is reasonable and you can offer some published experience that supports your treatment recommendation. The most common place that I deal with this issue is with PSMA PET scans, and I have not yet had an insurance company decline reimbursement for a PSMA PET when I can clearly explain why it's critical to the decision-making process. Of course, there are no national benchmarks set for prostate cancer care, but I think that you've learned from the talk I've given that adherence should be 80 to 90% to frequently used guidelines, but more importantly, it may be as high as 10 or 20% that it's necessary to deviate from a guideline for a particular patient. We are still physicians that have to use judgment, but we have to be able to document why our judgment calls for a deviation from guidelines.